Welcome back. My name is Stephanie Austin, and in this session, we'll have an introduction to monitoring and evaluation. There are many reasons to undertake monitoring and evaluation of adaptation, and we'll go over just a few here. So a big part is understanding what works well in managing climate risk and what doesn't work well and what could be done better. As you learned in Module 2, we don't know exactly what the future climate will look like. It will depend, especially in large part, on how much humans emit in the future. So adaptation is an iterative process. We're constantly learning and adjusting, and monitoring and evaluation can support our decision-making in this context of uncertainty. Monitoring and evaluation is also often a requirement for climate finance accountability or to comply with other reporting requirements. And lastly, monitoring and evaluation can help us to avoid maladaptation. Maladaptation refers to adaptation measures that can have unintended negative side effects. So if you think, for example, about heat waves, one adaptation measure could be to insert air conditioners in every building. But as you can also probably imagine, then that would really increase our energy use, which could exacerbate climate change itself. So that's an example of maladaptation. So through monitoring and evaluation, we can identify potential maladaptation to reduce or eliminate any negative side effects that may have occurred in the adaptation process. Since adaptation is so diverse, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to adaptation monitoring and evaluation. We can't just choose one single indicator that we apply for all monitoring and evaluation of adaptation. Choosing the right approach to monitoring and evaluation depends on the purpose of your monitoring and evaluating, which we'll see a little bit further in a moment, the context and content of your monitoring and evaluation, and also what kind of capacity and resources you have available to do your monitoring and evaluation. The purpose of the monitoring and evaluation system will determine what should be measured and what kind of approach you should be taking for monitoring and evaluation. So for example, if your purpose is for learning, you're trying to produce knowledge about the evolving adaptation context, needs, experience, what works well, what doesn't work well, then you might ask some questions like, are adaptation actions effective? Or how can adaptation be improved? If your purpose is for accountability, so let's say you're doing reporting to stakeholders on progress and or results, or doing reporting for climate finance, you might ask the question, how to report to international conventions and national frameworks on adaptation. If your purpose is for adaptive management, you're trying to check whether a policy or plan is on track and adjusting the course of action accordingly. You're trying to see whether the adaptation measures have been implemented on time according to budget, or if they've even been implemented at all. Then you might ask questions around, does implementation follow the intended path? You've seen this figure a few times before. It's showing the different infrastructure investment project phases and demonstrating that within each of those phases, you'll need to carry out each of the 4 climate proofing steps. So let's dig in a little deeper on how monitoring and evaluation might look under each of these steps. First, in the sector policy plans and regulations phase, for monitoring and evaluation, you might monitor and reassess whether climate resilience indicators and activities of the plans have actually reduced climate risk. In the project identification phase, you might monitor and reassess whether key criteria for the investment are valid or if they need to be changed due to changing climate conditions. For the project preparation phase, you might reassess whether identified measures have been proven successful and viable. For the resource mobilization phase, you might reassess whether policies contracted cover current and future climate risk. For the construction phase, you may reassess the performance of standard operating procedures. And lastly, in the operation and maintenance phase, in case changes in risks have been identified, you might provide feedback into the entire investment cycle if it's appropriate. We've talked many times about ecosystem-based adaptation in this course, so I'd like to bring your attention now to monitoring and evaluation in the context of EBA, and how monitoring and evaluation can provide solutions to some of the challenges that EBA faces. So one of the challenges, for example, is weak evidence base for EBA effectiveness. EBA is relatively new to the adaptation mainstream, so we don't necessarily have strong evidence to know what works well or what doesn't work well. One of the solutions monitoring and evaluation can provide is to enable evaluation of effectiveness. and provide concrete evidence for what does work well or what could be improved in the future. There's also a weak evidence base for co-benefits or the costs and benefits of EBA. And similarly here, monitoring and evaluation should collect corresponding data on the co-benefits and cost benefits of EBA and help fill some of that gap. EBA also responds to multiple pressures, both climatic and non-climatic. And one of the solutions that monitoring and evaluation provides is that it can include variables that capture both climatic and non-climatic drivers of change, so looking at the system more holistically. Lastly, another challenge is that EBA initiatives aim to achieve long-term outcomes and takes place in a context of changing climate hazards. And one of the solutions that EBA provides is to monitor against what's called a moving baseline. I hope that by this point you'll appreciate the need for adaptation monitoring and evaluation and the benefits it can provide to adaptation. But unfortunately, it also comes with some challenges to trying to implement monitoring and evaluation in practice. One of these is uncertainty, which makes the measurement of adaptation challenging. There is uncertainty about the exact extent of local climate change and variability, as well as the uncertainty about the development of socioeconomic parameters, especially over longer time spans. So for example, we don't know which of those emission scenarios we're going to be on over a long time frame, and we don't know how much humans will emit in the future. These kinds of uncertainties also affect the counterfactual, meaning what would have happened over time if the intervention had not been implemented at all. Complexity is another challenge. So climatic factors like changes in rainfall patterns and non-climatic stressors like deforestation, inadequate agricultural practices, etc. also interact. Also, a climate change impact such as water scarcity can influence many sectors in a cross-cutting way. So for example, less water affects agriculture, forestry, natural resources, energy, and the economy. So you can imagine how challenging it is to do monitoring and evaluation over such a broad range of sectors. It's also challenging to assess the outcomes of adaptation over a short time period if climate change impacts only manifest over a much longer time span. So for example, adaptation interventions could be seen as successful after just 3 years, but those implemented measures might be considered insufficient at a later date because of increasing climate change impacts or due to other changed circumstances. And lastly, there is no universal indicator to measure adaptation success, irrespective of the context. For mitigation, the globally applicable metric is reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, or the equivalents, but for adaptation, we really don't have any single metric that we can apply to all adaptation measures. It is entirely dependent on your context. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the next session with you.